Hi, everybody. Before we start, we want to make sure that you can hear this evening's speakers. So we're just going to ask them to talk extempore, and I'm going to ask you if you can hear. So say something complicated enough that they need to pay attention and tell you if they can understand.
Deconstruct the deferral.
Yeah.
My hovercraft is full of eels.
Okay, I think they got it. So without further ado, thank you all so much for being here. I'm thrilled at the turnout. I'm Dorothy Chansky, the director of the Humanities Center. And this is Translation, Unsettled Multiplicities. The second part of the first event of the fall being sponsored by the Humanities Center as part of this year's annual theme. The theme is Synoptics, Epistemologies of the Observer, which is kind of a big mouthful, but I'll bet everybody in here has some skills for unpacking that. What we're looking at this year with all our events and activities is how we, at our moment on this planet, with the privilege of being in the so-called first world, have available to us simultaneously multiple and mutually exclusive ways of seeing phenomena ranging from the so-called natural to the social. Translation is, of course, a way of seeing, a way of understanding, a way of doing. But as anybody who has read, let's say, famous or canonical literature from the past knows, we have simultaneously available to us multiple translations that speak to us in different ways and yet purport to speak the same text. So translation is an optic, and when multiple ones are in play, those of us with the good fortune to have access to them have synoptic possibilities. After the talk and the reception, which will be held in the Rotunda, I invite you all to play with one of the other parts of this year's Synoptics theme, which is an exhibit called Wordscape. And it's on a kiosk right outside the door. It's interactive. You can touch the screen. And I think if you take the opportunity to go and look at it, you'll see exactly what's going on. And it's fun, and it's supposed to be fun. Okay, I say this is part 2 of the first endeavor because some of you were with us last week when 4 of our faculty members responded to articles by our 2 guests, whom I'll introduce briefly in a second, with work of their own on translation. I don't know if everyone's here. John Husterian's here, Kanika Batra's here. Kanika coordinated it. Yuan Shu was on the panel, and Wyatt is here. All right, all 4 of last week's speakers. So some of you have already had a taste of translation as a way of seeing, multiple sets of ways of seeing, and of work by our 2 guests tonight. So our 2 guests tonight are Hans Saucy from the University of Chicago and Martin Huchner from Harvard University. I'm not going to belabor their bios because they are stunningly, amazingly wonderful and scholarly and personal ways. You will get a chance to talk with them after the presentation, and the bios are in your programs. So the format for tonight is that each of our guests is going to talk, give his own presentation, and they'll give you their titles for about 12 or 13 minutes, and then they're going to engage in a debate with each other, and I have no idea what form that's going to take, but I told them that gloves could be off. They know each other. And then we're going to open it up to you in the audience for questions for about another 20 minutes, and then we will eat, drink, be merry, and continue to socialize. So I don't know the order in which you all have decided to go, but have at it. Oh, Alphonse and Gaston, okay.
Okay. Well, you're first. Just to get it over with, I guess. It's always a pleasure to be invited to talk about translation because under that term, you can talk about just about anything, right? Almost anything can be described as a process of translation. You have obviously the translation from, let's say, Latin into English. We can talk about that, of course, in great detail, because every case of translation is its own thing, and there are always interestingly specific problems as well as some general problems. We could talk about the translation of theory into practice. We could talk about such things as the translation of, let's say, biology into, I'm going to make something up now, into geography. Basically any kind of intersection or interface between disciplines can be presented under the metaphorical guise of translation. My university boasts a thing called the Institute for Translational Medicine, which is not about talking to people about medicine in different languages, but it's about applying as quickly as possible discoveries that are made by the biological sciences people into applying them as therapeutic cures. So that's what people over at that end of the campus mean by translation. And so getting the stuff out of the labs and into the clinics. But the very fact that translation becomes this all-purpose metaphor makes me feel a little bit suspicious about it. And my suspicion was confirmed in the most glaring and blatant way when I was reading, actually, I'll say it, just to be truthful, rereading the old 1978 book by George Steiner called After Babel, Aspects of Translation, where at one point he says, well, actually, when any two human beings communicate in any way, an act of translation is occurring. So, if everything is translation, then nothing in particular is translation, I feel. So, what can we do to try to find a border, a useful boundary around translation by which to distinguish the things that are really central to translation, the important ones, and the other ones that might be just associative. So anyway, that's been part of my project for a while, trying to think about translation in a way that doesn't just license me to go off and free associate all the time, which is what I really like to do best. But I guess there's a vestige of Puritanism in me that says if you're enjoying this too much, it's probably not the right thing to be doing. So it's a joy to be on the same panel with Martin Kushner, whose work I've read for many years, and whose most recent publications have to do with the relationship between theater and philosophy, which is in some ways kind of a fraught relationship. Plato's dialogues, which arguably are the beginning of recognizable philosophy in the West, they both are and aren't theatrical. You can offend somebody by saying they are, and you can offend somebody by saying they aren't. They're in a funny kind of in-between state. But when I think about theater and philosophy, or let's say literature and philosophy, I have the impression of being in the presence of an old couple who are always fighting some old fight, even when it's not appropriate to do so. Right? It's as if, one of them says, I'd like some toast, and the other says, you always say it that way, and I just can't stand it when you say it that way. Right? And so suddenly you're in the middle of psychodrama, and you haven't even recognized what the precipitating factor was. There's a nice little example of this in the reception by Jacques Derrida of a short book by John Austin that I'm sure all of you know, How to Do Things with Words. Wonderful book, but Derrida fails to understand when Austin is making a joke. And he's making one joke right on this line between theater and philosophy. Austin has been saying, now, when we talk about performative utterances, right? Utterances that make something happen in the world, like I pronounce you man and wife or whatever. He says, now, obviously, these kinds of statements will be hollowed in a peculiar way when they are said, for example, as part of a joke or on a stage. And he goes on to talk about some other things. And Derrida, as if suddenly awakened by this reminiscence of the old conflict between philosophy, which claims to talk about true things, and literature, which philosophy thinks talks about false things and therefore misleading things, and therefore evil things, he immediately rises to the challenge and begins to say all kinds of terrible things about Austin and about Anglo-Saxon ordinary language philosophers in general as having completely missed the point of art and fictionality and simulacra and all these things. Whereas I think what Austin is doing is preparing a joke. He's playing a little bit of a long game. Because a little bit farther down in the same chapter, he says, now, one thing we don't want to do is imagine that our lives are lived in two planes where our secret inner intention is the thing that determines whether our performative statements are to be taken as effective or not. It will do no good to say, as the person says in Euripides' play Hippolytus, my tongue uttered the oath, but my heart did not. It will do, and it's absolutely not helpful to bring in the intervention of some backstage artiste, maybe the mind, the heart, the spirit, the soul, whatever you want to call it. These sorts of things we simply have to rule out of court and say, our word is our bond. If you said it, you bought it, basically. And so Austin is being very clever here because the supposed locus of truth, right, the heart, the mind, the spirit, is by him being relegated to the stage, to the status of an actor on a stage who says things that are necessarily hollow because they're uttered from backstage, right? So in fact, Austin is very cleverly putting philosophy in the place of the artificial thing on the stage, which is what philosophers, of course, never say about themselves, but only about other people in the traditional setup that Derrida was very energetically trying to undo. So in a way, Derrida scored a kind of an own goal, as they would say, on the soccer field. Right? Austin was actually helping his point, but he didn't recognize it, perhaps because there was, after all, a linguistic difference between them. Derrida, a French-speaking person reading Austin in English, might have missed the little indications that Austin is being humorous here and there, and certain allusions that he makes to texts that are very familiar to people in the English-speaking world that may not have registered with a French speaker. So here's the old scene then where philosophy mistreats theater, and Derrida rises to the occasion to save theater from philosophy, not having noticed that Austin has already saved theater from philosophy, and now it's really philosophy that's in danger of being taken over by theater. Right? So I've always felt that this is a very humorous situation of misprision, where the person who is famous for writing very plain, understated language, that is Austin, manages to put across a point in such a subtle fashion that the person whose style everybody complains about as being impossibly baroque and complex and hard to follow, that person, in fact, falls into the trap of the understated guy. That actually recalls a fellow named Socrates, right, who was similarly said to be both plain-spoken and a setter of traps. So the ironies are historical and they echo along a very long corridor. But so to go back to the main point, if Austin, by using his stage metaphor already in the critique of a certain kind of intentionalist philosophy, was already doing better what Derrida was trying to do, this will tend to spread. And in fact, Austin's book treats law, religion, every kind of serious discourse in the same way through this system of allusions to stage plays. So that's the thing to think about, right? Here's a case where Austin is performing a kind of a translation or a metaphorical transposition of one set of discourses, the more serious ones, into the supposedly less serious ones, and then something interesting happens to them, right? So that when law or religion is put on the stage and made into a stage play, you have to evaluate it in different terms than you would if you simply thought that you knew where the boundary between serious and hollow utterances is supposed to be. So there's a case of what you might call a kind of mimesis, right? A kind of reenactment or representation or reproduction of a reality, but in an unfamiliar situation. And mimesis interests me in translation too, because there's a kind of translation-related phenomenon that is very mimetic, but usually doesn't qualify as translation. Let's imagine that I'm telling you something, say, 60 or 70 years ago, and I say, well, there's this feeling that the Germans have a word for. It's called Schadenfreude. And then I have to explain what Schadenfreude is. It's a feeling of rejoicing when someone else has bad luck. Right? But by now, that word has been used so often that I think most of us could probably say, oh man, I had such an experience of Schadenfreude today. And we wouldn't have to gloss it to people because it's become part of English. Right? At one time we had to flag it and say it's a foreign word, here's what it means. and by now it's become accepted. Or, other things, right? Enough people are experienced with formerly exotic practices, like, say, Chinese medicine, right? You can perhaps walk into your coffee bar and they say, how are you doing today? And you say, my chi is very low. And they'll know what you mean, right? A certain number of people in the coffee bar will know what you mean, right? Because they too have been to see the person who's there to fix up their chi. And chi, by the way, is what we call mojo in my part of the world, right? And when you get your chi working, you feel much better. So anyway, these words are always coming into languages from outside. And the trick, the test case is when you can begin talking about them without a footnote. But when we incorporate these things from outside, we're doing a kind of mimesis that isn't exactly a translation. Right? It would be translation if we came up with some equivalent for the words in the English that we already possess. Right? So let's say vital energy, say, for chi. And of course, it would always be an imperfect translation, and we'd keep on refining it, or we would come up with some equivalent for Schadenfreude and so on. So I like to think about transliteration as the name for the thing that happens when we perform this sort of echolalia, right? Simply miming the word that the foreigners use by way of introducing the foreign concept into our language. And this kind of echolalia, echolalia being literally reproducing the other person's words, right? There are certain mental conditions where a propensity for echolalia is diagnostic. Right? You say to the person, how are you today? And they say, how are you today? And you wonder, okay, is this a conversation? You say, my name is Bertram. And they answer you, my name is Bertram. And then you say, okay, this is clearly not a conversation in the mode of call and response, but a mode of echo. Well, when you have this kind of repetition of other people's words, you're raising the question of authenticity, of whose words they are really, of what's being meant, of what the roles are. And that actually is a very broad problem. I sometimes think about the discussion of roles, right? The idea of roles, another term that is imported from theater into, say, sociological discourse, another metaphorical transference. But this term of roles has had its own little history. If you go back a generation or two and look at Erving Goffman's classic book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, he acknowledges that we're always on stage in some way. I'm very much on stage right now, thank you. But if you're buying groceries, if you're talking with people in the street or whatever, you're always presenting yourself as a certain sort of person. Like this is Goffman's main thesis in this book. And in one point of the book, he says, now we do have a backstage self. Right? When nobody's looking, then we can relapse into being ourselves. We can relax. We can be authentic. If you forward the tape a few years, you'll find people like Judith Butler discussing roles in a way that doesn't assume that there's an authentic backstageness to us, but that in fact the roles are us, and that we never can stop playing. Even when we're with ourselves, we're playing roles to ourselves. And Butler has a very unusual vocabulary to talk about what she calls sometimes the congealing of a formerly fluid action into a kind of a fixed role. So thinking about the difference between Goffman and Butler talking about these roles, you might say, okay, mimesis is a kind of contagion, right? You become the thing that you imitate. If I say Schadenfreude too much, I'm going to turn into a German. Oh my God, I'm not prepared for that at all, right? If I say chi enough times, who knows, right? I might become a Taoist immortal and fly away. That would be pretty cool. But so my interest in this contagious mode of transcription, of imitation, is partly that it doesn't fit in our classic model of translation in which we use the words of language B to express something that was formerly expressed in language A, but rather we're mixing and hybridizing and collaging the two languages together in a way that is often scandalous. I like to quote a passage of Samuel Johnson where he says, the great pest of language is constant translation. He says, you can't translate a book from a foreign language without bringing some of the tinge of that language into English. And we really have to stop the translations from French. says Jocelyn particular, because they're warping the language. Even the sentence patterns that people use are becoming more and more Frenchified, so we just have to blockade that stuff off. Right? That's the purist take on things. And I don't share that purist take, but I do note that this practice of echoing awakens that kind of anxiety in the purist. We could also think of this kind of echoing mode of representation as a sort of translation that doesn't go all the way on the path from the other's language to our language. And you can think of it as maybe an incomplete translation. Derrida, whom I mentioned a little bit ago, says something very beautiful about translation, which I think is kind of true, but needs to be thought about a little bit. He says, in an interview that he did in 2004, so just a few years before dying, he said, "Traduire, c'est perdre le cœur." Translating is losing the body. When you translate, you lose the body. And to decant this into small enough bottles to apply to particular situations, I think, okay, you know, if I have something that is linguistically embodied in one language, if I translate it, I have to forsake the body that it had in Latin or Spanish or whatever, in order to give it a new body in English. We always think of translation as this kind of transition from one body to another, as if there was a kind of metempsychosis. Right? And then, you know, translation that fails would then be kind of dangerous. It would be like a process of soul transfer that leaves the soul no longer anchored in a body but wandering around helplessly, and that would be very, very distressing. But there are a lot of different kinds of bodies that can be lost in a translation. The bodies of the particular words that were used, or the bodies of particular situations that might have had to be invoked, right, contexts and so on. For this, I like to think of a piece by Eugene Nida, a Bible translator, written way back in the 60s, who is talking about what the conditions for successful biblical translation are. And one group of people who will never allow themselves to say that translation is impossible is Bible translators, right? Because just by being what they are, they have to accept the universality of the message. That's what they're all about. And so Nida says, when you translate, you have to simply make sure that you're translating the purport, right, the gist of the message. And so if you have a passage about sheep and sheep gambling on the hill, and you're trying to explain that passage to, let's say, the residents of the northern end of Greenland, where there are no sheep and where it's icy all the time, you're going to have to find some pragmatic equivalent that will enable you to get the same message across. So if you're very attached to the sheep and you say, I can't have this New Testament passage without sheep in it, right? You're refusing to let go of that body. And from the point of view of the Bible translator who wants to get this purportedly universal message out to the Ninettes and everyone else living up in the Arctic Circle, you would be so superstitiously clinging to that body. You'd be doing the wrong thing. You have to be willing to give it up. But the body sometimes is worth keeping in that way, right? And this too is a reason for my being interested in the echoing style of translation, because it insists on hanging on to the body even when it's irrelevant, even when you might be in Greenland with sheep, which you don't want. All right, so anyway, I want to get round to talking a little bit about Martin's piece, which many of you have read, about minding the gap between literature and philosophy. It's a lovely piece because I think it has a lot of philosophical tact. It talks about why it's important to conserve the specificity of theater and philosophy, because if you simply mix them together, you would wind up with a kind of an indifferent melange, right? That you, in fact, release more energy when you bring these two things together than when they're either kept completely apart or completely mixed together. And I think that's very tactful. It's a way of saying that the use of absolute prescriptions for how to handle these categories will often leave us with something that we didn't want at all. Whereas what we wanted is a kind of transgression that becomes possible only as long as there's a line to transgress. So I think we'll probably come up to that a little bit later in the further discussion. But one boundary that is worth thinking about is the boundary of purported untranslatabilities. That's one of the things that Martin and I have scheduled for our continued discussion in a moment. Martin, I hand the podium over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. So I think Dorothy's idea has been that you're supposed to disagree. And I think that there would be a debate.
Disagree with me.
Exactly. There would be drama and clash. But I'm not entirely sure whether I do disagree with you. Though academics like to disagree with each other. But if academics like to disagree with each other, there's one thing they like even better, and that's to rant. So since I don't have much to disagree with, I have a rant. And when it comes to translation, I have a translation rant. And I think I'll just need to get this out of the way real quick, and then we can come back to have a rational discussion about translation. So the rant is this. It has to do with untranslatability, this concept that's been haunting translation theory, I think more than translation practice for many decades, and it's still around. And so my rant about untranslatability, this term, is as follows: that it seems to me a complete misnomer, which is ironic, since the school of untranslatability, the school that always wants to find moments of untranslatability in literature and really celebrates these moments as the true authentic of the literature, literariness of literature's most itself. It's a misnomer, ironically enough, because what translatability really asserts is that it is impossible to translate, or that translation has necessary limits, that there are moments that cannot be translated, period. Now, it's a misnomer because I think what they really mean is that it's difficult to translate, that translation is flawed, that it's imperfect, that we have to redo it many times, and that's part of the dynamic of translation. And that may be true. I think that places the emphasis in the wrong position, but it's a misnomer, because if we started to call everything that's flawed or imperfect impossible, I think in this world of ours, nothing would be possible, because everything is flawed and imperfect and so on and so forth. So it's a misnomer. Untranslatability, I think the word should simply not be used. And it's misleading, and this is the real reason for my rant, because I think it's derailed the discussion about translation. It's sent hordes of graduate students and scholars looking for moments of untranslatability, and I plead guilty. I was one of them. Everybody in comp-lit grad school would go out and be really proud when they found another moment that was untranslatable and came back and showed everybody this precious little thing. And the more such moments you found, the more authentically comp-lit you really were. An badge of honor. Finding these moments of untranslatability. This is really what comp-lit, in a sense, was all about. And that just seemed to me to disregard that it happens all the time. It's totally ubiquitous, and I would argue, by and large, quite successful. So it I think, sent everyone to these marginal phenomena rather than thinking about the process of what constitutes the center of translation. It's interesting to think about what motivated this school of untranslatability. I think to some extent you can trace it back. It's very interesting that you mentioned the Bible, since I think it seems to me to have to do something with a kind of literary fundamentalism. Because where are the debates about untranslatability in the history of literature most clearly located? They're located in sacred scripture. Now, it's true that some sacred texts were happier to think about being translated than others. But if you think, for example, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, there are big debates about it. There had to be a story, it was really a miracle that these 70 translators all came up with the same version. If you think about the New Testament, the struggles for legitimacy when the New Testament, from its Latin translation, is translated into the various vernaculars. And of course, most famously, perhaps the case of the Quran, where you can't even speak of a translation of the Quran, but only translations of the meaning of the Quran. So it seems to me that there's a strain of literary fundamentalism that underpins, to some extent, this school, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, the school of untranslatability, and that seems to me a mistake. Breathing. My rant. And I think I should probably explain a little bit how I came to this rant, because I said I myself was a card-carrying member of the Party of Untranslatability through my studies with Derrida and so on and so forth. So where did I have my conversion experience, really, to away from untranslatability? And this had to do with the moment when, for my sins, I became associated with a huge world literature anthology, one of these 6-volume world literature anthologies that go from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the present, and that are really primarily meant for sort of freshman and sophomore use survey courses introducing students to different kinds of literatures and cultures. At first I was very excited about this project, and then it started to dawn on me that this was mostly a kind of managerial project, that it wasn't probably very smart to be associated with it, because there's a lot of busy work and a lot of compromises. And the reason why you can tell that it wasn't very smart to be associated with the project is because the smart people would stay away from these and the way I know this is because I asked Tom whether he would join this project. As you can tell, he's a really smart person, and he said, no, you go and do this on your own. So there I was stuck without Han with this anthology. And it was a very frustrating experience, but there's this one good thing that came out of it, and that it really, I think, converted me away from the school of untranslatability. Why? Because I began to realize, I spent a lot of time with translation. One of the main works of working on this anthology was comparing translation, commissioning some translations, thinking about that long history of literature in translation, and it really drove home to me the point that this school of untranslatability, which is also the school of loss, right? The loss of the body. I think in that sense, Derrida's very typical or representative of that, is a mistake. It's a mistake just from my own experience, and I would be curious what you all think, that I don't think I've ever lost anything through translation. I think I've only gained. That certainly was my experience in working on this anthology, which really blew my mind. It exposed me to literature I'd never even heard of before. It really changed my view of what literature is, and with it, what translation can be or should be. So, and the main point about that was that it's unhelpful to think about translation, certainly in terms of impossible or possible, since plainly all the evidence is on the side of possible, because it's everywhere. But also that even the alternative or substitute binary of good and bad is probably not even the right one. Because really what the question about translation is that struck me most working on this anthology is the question of the purpose. What's the purpose of a given translation? So if you will, it's a kind of utilitarian, pragmatic and utilitarian view of translation, because what we editors really had to do is think very much of the purpose of any given text. And as I said, this anthology, the purpose of this anthology is to introduce students to these cultures and texts that they had never even heard before. And one of the other pleasures besides the conversion experience of working on the anthology is that I go to a lot of schools that adopt the anthology and talk to students and teachers And that's very satisfying, this kind of outreach, if you will. And it became very clear very quickly that for many of these texts, you have to meet the students halfway or even more. So there are a couple of strategies or criteria that emerged for us as really crucial about translation. One could be described as a question of literal translation versus a kind of poetic retelling. So for example, right now, Norton brought out a wonderful retelling of the Mahabharata by Karl Satyavorty, which is not a literal translation, but it's a wonderful reading experience, just perfect for an anthology like that. The other famous sort of poetic retelling / translation is Seamus Heaney's translation, if that's the right word, of Beowulf. Based on that experience, what Norton has done a lot is pair a scholar with a poet or dramatist, and in order to somehow combine this fidelity to literal translation with the necessity of trying to make the text really sing in English. In other cases, and I'm sure Han has a lot to say about that, is the Tale of Genji. It's a wonderful text that students like a lot, but if you presented a literal translation, it would be more or less unreadable because no one would be able to keep track of any of the characters. There are many characters and they're constantly referred to through different names, often relational names. So you need a text that's not literal, but that is in some sense explanatory, that adds this layer of able to identify names. And yes, in some way that takes away the enigma and the ambiguity of the text, but it also makes it in a fundamental sense readable. And it's interesting that even I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that modern Japanese readers have texts that basically do the same kind of explanation, identification, that these kinds of paraphrase, that these translations provide. In yet another genre, in drama, and I work a lot on drama, the interesting criterion is not only how it reads on the page, but how would it work on stage, or at least in a dramatic reading. Here my favorite example is, again, a kind of retelling by Carol Churchill of Thyestes. She worked with a literal translation from Latin, and she contracted a few moments, but turned it into a really powerful text that works, of course, on the stage, since Carol Churchill is an accomplished playwright. So for this genre, yet another criterion emerged, and that was playability, if you will, in addition to readability. So these were the kind of utilitarian, if you will, purposes of translation that emerged as really central, rather than the impossibility dwelling on the loss, the bemoaning the infidelity to the original, and so on and so forth. That seems to me really still part of that literary fundamentalism that I have come to associate with this school of impossibility. And since all of this emerged in the context of working on this world literature anthology, it might be interesting to note that this is very much part of the very concept of world literature from the beginning. And it's interesting that this is what both the fans and the detractors of world literature agree upon, that world literature, of course, depends on translation. And for this, we can go back to the person who coined the term world literature in 1827, namely Wolfgang von Goethe, except he didn't use the word world literature, he used the word Weltliteratur, which can be, I would argue, translated very easily and without any loss of the body or anything into world literature. I mean, it translates itself almost. So he coined this term, interestingly, just after having read a Chinese novel, and we talked about this earlier, one of the first Chinese novels to be translated into Western languages, where to try to get his hands on all the novels from China. There were 4 in total. Some were translated partially into Portuguese, some into English, and 2 into German. it was in the course of thinking about this reading experience of this Chinese novel that in speaking to his assistant or secretary, Ackermann, he said that the age of world literature has arrived. Ackermann, the secretary, did not know what to make of it. He was surprised the age of world literature. The Chinese have novels. Goethe was sure, yes, they do. They have thousands of them. He admonished his assistant, his provincial, ignorant of business, and they have thousands of them, and they were writing novels when we were still living up in the trees. And this really shut up Ackermann, and he started to think about how he would have to read these thousands of Chinese novels, and so he changed the subject of the conversation. But this is really the moment when Goethe invents this term, world literature, and while in this conversation it trailed off because Ackermann did not know what to do with this information, Goethe then subsequently develops a take on world literature that depends everywhere on translation. It's clear to him that translation is what fuels this exchange of literature. And he thinks of it, interestingly, very much in terms of a market. There's a market now in the early to middle 19th century in world literature through commerce, and it's fueled by translation. And Goethe thinks about it very pragmatically because he himself translated a lot. He was a translator. He knew how hard it is, but not impossible. He knew how badly paid it is, which it still is, but nevertheless, it is what fuels translation. In fact, he compares it to money. He says translations make literature circulate the way coins do other commodities. So he does think, in some sense, of literature as a commodity, as a world market, but he thinks it's a great thing because it makes world literature possible. So from the beginning here, there is a market-driven, if you will, translation-based notion of world literature that is underpinned by literature. So in contemplating that, I guess it makes sense that I had my conversion experience through working on world literature. And translation is still the term through which today world literature is debated, both pro and con. And so I wonder whether we can continue to talk about that. And in responding to what Han just said, I'm really, in part because I'm so gung-ho about translation, I completely agree with your initial point about limiting translation and thinking about very specific contexts, what works and what doesn't, what's the purpose here and there, what isn't. And also thinking about sort of subsets or associated terms like transliteration and transcription. And this is perhaps maybe the last thing I want to say here, is that when you contemplate the 4,000 years of literature that we have, it becomes clear there are many purposes to translation, but there's one ultimate purpose, and that's survival. If you don't get translated, you simply don't survive as literature, because languages come and go. There are two perfect examples of this, and examples with which usually courses in world literature and therefore anthologies in world literature begin. One is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was never transliterated or transcribed out of the cuneiform writing system. So it died with it. And we wouldn't have it if these cuneiforms hadn't been dug up in the late 19th century and the writing system deciphered. The other example is the Hebrew Bible. One can argue whether that would have been the fate of the Hebrew Bible as well, except the Hebrew Bible very smartly allowed itself to be translated into Koine Greek and started to circulate wider and wider and became, therefore, the most important text in world literature.
Well,
Sorry about the rant.
no, it was a very good rant. Here, I'm thinking about moving the goalposts around a little bit. What if we were to say, okay, there's no such thing as translation. There's just different styles of adaptation.
Okay.
Now, some people will be made happy, some people will be made mad. Right? And it's useful to think about who's made happy and who's made mad, right? Because even though it's literal translation, you might say, okay, it's just an adaptation. Right? That would seem to be a little bit offensive to the hard work of all the people who are doing the most scrupulous kind of translation. Because when we think about adaptation, we're just conceding huge margin of freedom to the person who adapts, right? If I have, say, Mahabharata, right, all 20 volumes of it, and I want to adapt it to the dimensions of a Saturday morning cartoon, people will say, okay, it's not a very good representation of Mahabharata, but it's adapted for that purpose, so that's okay, right? But then the person who is, like, say, Barbara Johnson translating the prose essays of Mallarmé, who is listening with a just uncanny ear for detail and resonance and implication and managing to get more than you would think humanly possible into English. You'd say, what, you're going to judge her by that same slack, sloppy standard? That's insulting. You can't do that to Barbara Johnson, right? So, you can see how it would be liberating on one end and in a way annoying and constraining on the other.
So it's interesting. I think it's a very interesting way of testing this out, because I would say that I would question whether this question of freedom and constraint, because it seems to me that any adaptation, including especially of the Mahabharata into a completely different medium, takes liberties, but also at the same time submits itself to the constraints of the different medium. So I think it's not a question of free-for-all, but I would say it's a different set of constraints. And I think that your idea of proposing adaptation actually very nicely gets at that, because it comes back to this question of purpose, because every adaptation has a certain purpose and will therefore fail. So, the cartoon Mahabharata may succeed or fail for reasons that would be then interesting to see. But I wonder whether freedom and constraints are not at work in both.
They definitely are.
Barbara Johnson, my dissertation advisor,
and
cartoonish.
I know you're
You're trying to really.
I know where you
live.
Or think of, say, Jane Austen novels adapted for the movies, right? People talk about, the adaptations being, faithful or whatever, but the main thing is they give these audiences a new novel, these novels a new audience.
Right.
Because not everybody's going to go to the bookstore and ask for that novel and take it home and read it. Some people will be more likely to be attracted into that world by seeing the movie, and then maybe they'll read all the other Jane Austen novels.
And then by the Derridian, body count, there are more bodies.
Lots
So,
of bodies,
you don't lose a body in translation, you gain bodies.
You gave some bodies.
That's
true.
But,
Another instance, though, here's a case where you might say the constraints are really, really restrictive on both ends, and this is a 19th century medium that might not be central now, I'm thinking about it today, but 150 years ago was central to artistic communication, and that's opera. We don't think about this, but 150 years ago, if Verdi or Wagner wrote an opera that was a big success, it would be performed in Buenos Aires, it would be performed in Sydney, it would be performed all around the world in other languages. And it was no big deal for the great opera stars to pack up their bags in Venice and go to St. Petersburg to sing Donizetti in Russian. It was just one of those things that you did. But behind that has to be translators who are going syllable by syllable, right, operating under the most strict poetic constraints. And what they produced was not always great poetry, but they were living under certain constraints that were very hard to honor, because if you did it wrong, the whole effect of the medium would collapse.
Although the good thing, I suppose, is before supertitles, no one understood a word anyway.
Some imaginary audience member understood.
Maybe that's really interesting what supertitles do, because suddenly, you do really understand the word, every word, and I would say arguably that was probably not the case before.
before. Probably not. Or people were, looking at their little facing text libretto as they go through. But so anyway, there's the case where you have, lots of body.
Right. And adaptation. So I think the adaptation is a very useful, it seems to me, test. Because it shows purpose, because an adaptation will elevate the purpose.
It's add, right? It's the add and adaptation means going towards, right?
Yes.
So it focuses on the arrival point of translation, makes us less obsessed with where it starts.
I mean, the other, of course, interesting thing about translation, and if you wanted to really put pressure on this, gung-ho translation is so great, would be to go into something like Google Translate. So, which is very interesting. So I would like to, since I know that you have background in sort of hardcore linguistics and Leibniz and this kind of, let's say, prehistory of an earlier attempt at machine translation that was all about cracking the code, the deep grammar of language, and so on and so forth. A project that I think largely failed. What's interestingly has succeeded is crowdsourcing, essentially, right? This is how Google Translate works. It's not by trying to really crack the code of language. It's just by feeding translated text, and the more, the better. And I think it is getting better. I mean, I haven't checked it recently. But it's such a different kind of approach to translation.
Yeah, the model used to be, let's formulate a rule whereby we can have the right word for this English thing we are translated into German or Italian, and then we'll know what to do. And the nice thing is that that intervening stage of the rule doesn't really exist for Google Translate. It says, let's find all the cases where somebody is attempting to establish a parallel, or where these two words happen in sequence in the original text. Let's find out what the similar sequences are in other texts, and then we'll just sort of proclaim a correlation. And if you don't have enough examples, and there probably needs to be an enormous amount of examples for a very complex text, you don't have enough examples, then it doesn't work, or it gives you a very partial result.
Right. And it's interesting that, as I understand, what really feeds Google Translate is where's the place where you have the same text translated from many different languages, the UN. So they get their hands on all these UN documents and feed the Google Translate.
UN documents, like car manuals?
Yeah.
Because when Volkswagen makes a car, they have to publish a manual for it in every language.
Of course, no one will
sell admittedly, I was taking a risk. But there are these empirical things where people have translated, and the genius of the Google people is to say, all right, we'll just take all that as our data and correlate the examples without trying to infer a rule. I mean, Leibniz, since you mentioned my favorite guy, he dreamt of a universal language where all the meanings of all the different languages would be correlated with one particular sign in this universal language. And so two-way translation was always guaranteed.
Yes. Yeah.
And as he thought about it a little bit more, he thought, well, actually, languages don't always refer to the same meanings, and we need a language that will include all of the meanings, including meanings that have never been spoken in any language. And for that, then he thought he could devise a kind of a Crayola box of the basic meanings in language that, if you couldn't get your shade of meaning, you could take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and mix them together in the grand grammar. And this is something that he spent 30 or 40 years of his life trying to work out. And this is, after all, one of the guys who invented calculus. So he wasn't a silly person. But it does seem, the place where that ideal language would exist is very hard to imagine, right? It's kind of being designed for a speaker who's never been found yet. So quite the opposite of the Google, which would be, let's find out what all the speakers have already done. Maybe they did it wrong, but we'll start from that and make correlations.
And now that we're thinking about it, it seems to me, right, that Leibniz is precisely the kind of, is the unsuccessful, derailed machine translation project, whereas it seems to me Google Translate is closer to Goethe's notion of world literature, which is just, let's take all the literatures, let's take all the Chinese novels, let's not worry about, is it good, is it bad, what creates sort of a rarefied canon of world literature. Let's somehow let it circulate. Let's take it all. Let's translate as much as possible. Let's see what happens.
There's an optimistic empiricism where you say, okay, more data will come
Yes,
along.
exactly.
You know, there are all those thousands of Chinese novels. Let's make it worth their while for
Yeah.
more people to translate them, and then we'll learn more about what was wrong with what words we were using.
So let's make it worth our while to have more people in the conversation. So we do have some time left for, we have time for questions and answers. Prior to segueing into refreshments. So who else would like to jump in? You are?
Well, actually, I was fascinated by both of your talks, and I'm particularly interested in Hong because there's this sort of connection there. You mentioned that use the example of Derrida, how Derrida sort of missed the joke of Austin in the text. But I was thinking that I think that maybe I'm more interested in the politics of translation and the politics of thing. So in this case, is it possible to have a sort of innovative misreading? I mean, purposely misread something in order to create something else. In Derrida's case, and also I was thinking in other cases, like the famous case of, say, Ezra Pound's poetry. T.S. Eliot famously said, Ezra Pound is the inventor of Chinese poetry. In that sense, I'm not like offered, sort of a post-colonial political reading of that, but my reading is that actually it creates something interesting that is not accessible, available in Chinese poetry. So in that sense, that's misreading, innovative misreading to create something unique about modernist American poetry. That's fascinating there. And another thing, you talk about micro, both levels of translation. I was thinking another example of innovative translation in terms of talk about technology. Chinese allegedly invented gunpowder, but it's the Western countries that are sort of perfect and invent the firearms. So in that case, that's innovative. Chinese only built firecrackers for 2,000 years. Never thought of like firearms to kill people and enemies. So that's an innovative mistranslation, which was fascinating in that extent. So what do you make of this? Is that untranslatability or translatability, or how do you, at macro level, micro level, or political reading of these translations?
Did everybody hear the question? Okay, good, then I don't have to repeat it.
Yeah, it's like it's like gunpowder in that you don't know what's going to happen to it once the invention is loosed upon the world. And I think that's the case with translation. And it's very funny. Just this morning I was writing something about Eliot's essay where he talks about Pound being the inventor of Chinese poetry for our time, and commenting on this word invention because Eliot is very canny, right? He doesn't want to say that these are translations because he knows that there are scholars who would say, you got everything wrong. The tone is wrong. He missed this allusion there. He turned two different poems into the same poem because he didn't pay attention or whatnot. So he's very wary not to say that it's a translation, but he wants to praise it. However, he also knows that an invention is something that works if there's a need to which it corresponds, right? If you had invented, let's say, the automobile in the 6th century BC, maybe there was no social framework in which an automobile could be used, and so the invention would just go to nothing. Pound was somebody who was looking at the situation. In his understanding, English poetry desperately needed something that, as far as he was concerned, could be provided only from Chinese sources. And this is an invention that worked because, in fact, I think Pound's cafe is probably, I've said this before in press, I guess I have to go on saying it, I don't want to contradict myself, but it's one of the 2 or 3 most influential books of poetry in the whole 20th century in English. It really reformed the way people wrote. And that wouldn't have happened without this thing coming in from outside, which Pound, incidentally, was completely incapable of reading, right? He was working for someone else's notes. So, yes, I'm very interested in the situation of displacement. It's a little bit different, I think, from the Austen and Derrida situation. He may have been wanting to create a very dramatic split between continental and Anglo-American philosophy, which had been coexisting more or less. There were some overlaps, and I think he somewhat envenomed that set of exchanges with what happened later, because then Searle takes the defense of Austen, and I think Searle misunderstands Austen's playfulness too, and it just gets worse and worse. and it may take another generation or two to patch it up. But somebody may come along historically and say, actually, this split was what was needed so as to eliminate confusion between two ways of doing philosophy. So it could be that it was a Felix Gopa.
Another question? Kanika?
A bit of a disagreement with Dr. Putner's notion of untranslatability. The version of comparative literature and post-colonial studies that I'm familiar with from Africa and from Southern Asia does not believe in untranslatability. So I think there is a disciplinary divide here within perhaps the American comparative literature context. The notion of untranslatability has been valued or sort of made much of, if not valued, you know. But at least in India, when I was a grad student, there was a boom in the translation industry on two levels. First, the governmental sort of propagation of diversity of languages. But then how do you make people who are different speakers of languages familiar with each other's literature? So the National Academy of Letters for the past 50 years has been on a translation spree, which is a good thing, I think. And then the private publishing enterprises caught on. And Macmillan, for instance, launched a huge project in translation, Macmillan India. And so at least when I was in grad school, untranslatability was never considered a very important facet of comparative literature as a discipline.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. But the person I've had screaming fights, a wonderful person to have screaming fights with is Gayatri Spivak. She is like, the cheerleader of untranslated, one of the many. But she's not representative of all,
For sure.
Of course,
and I have my agreements and disagreements with Spivak too, but among the post-colonial scholars whom I think you take to task in your essay on Ibsen, Gede, and the concept of world literatures, among those group of scholars, the person who has done the most to popularize the idea of translation has also been coincidentally Gayatri Spivak. Even though she might be holding on to notions of untranslatability, but she herself, as a multilingual translator of Derrida, of South Asian writing,
Right.
Terrible
translation.
Yes.
Yet it introduced so many of us
It
to
did,
that
it did.
road
So
to
it-
which we would otherwise
Like
have no
it's true.
access.
Which proves, I think, my point.
But I'm sort of taking issue with that notion of post-colonial theorists, by and large, holding on to the notion of untranslatability because at least, from the African context and from the Indian context, I'm not familiar with that notion at all.
Well, I think that's wonderful. Yes, I don't think it's interesting that I think it's much more this school of untranslatability, this fascination with untranslatability is actually much more located in a few very vocal and at the time very influential sort of elite Western universities, and actually not and that's part of my beef with it, is that it just doesn't capture the actual practice of translation, the necessity of translation, the incredible, pleasure and joy of translation that is actually practiced by a lot of people.
Yeah, I see a different subtext here, perhaps, which is that the defense of the untranslatable might be useful in the American context, where we have a basically monolingual, a country that imagines itself as monolingual.
I didn't want to say that,
Where you always have to be defending foreign languages and the need to know languages.
Yeah.
And it's also an extremely pragmatic country. So many people will say, hey, if that book exists in translation, great, I don't have to learn the language that book came from. And we have to always be saying, yes, but, it's great that you have a translation, but let's continue to support foreign language teaching and learning. Let's continue to introduce bilingualism in the schools so that we can also say, all of you foreigners who come to this country, you have to learn English because it's the only language we're interested in. We have to be able to say there are kinds of subjectivity and tradition that are preserved in and through a language, and they have value and they must be preserved. in a place, I'm imagining, I've never been to India, but in a place where it is known that hundreds of languages are already being spoken, and that you're not going to get people to drop those languages ever, then that's the fact on the ground that then allows people to say, of course, translation is a great thing because we can connect the languages and none of them are in danger of being killed by translation, whereas we would fear that here.
You know, I would agree if it were the case that in the U.S., right, people would not want to go to the trouble of learning foreign languages, but there would be a flood of translation. But that's not the case. The U.S. has the tiniest percent, only 2% of literature sold in the U.S. is translation, actually.
So I just want to jump in and ask
Yes.
a question, which has